Good afternoon, colleagues.
You need that.
I probably do. See how I can multitask. I'd like to provide some remarks this afternoon on Australian Reinsurance Pool Corporation, ARPC. I'd like to talk to you briefly about how our ARPC operates. I'll talk about the evolving nature of terrorism from an Australian perspective, and then I'd like to explain some of the recent changes to the ARPC scheme and what we expect to see in future changes over the next 3 years. Just briefly, ARPC is government owned. We were set up in 2003. In fact, I think we might be the youngest pool, a bit like Australia. As a government entity, it means that we sort of have interesting intersection between government. We get to talk to government agencies as a government organisation, but we're a financial corporation and with a minister as a shareholder, and that means that we have customers, and we have over 240 insurance company customers, and we have over 60 reinsurance providers through our retrocession program. We were set up in 2003. When we were established, no one that designed us in 2003 expected ARPC to be in existence in 2006. So there was a 3-year window put in place with a hard review, and there was certainly no expectation that we'd be sitting here today talking about terrorism. So it was very much set up as a temporary organisation. To that vein, it was set up as a voluntary scheme for insurers. So I think the unique aspect of the scheme is that insurers can choose to cede their risk into the pool or not. However, the legislation that it operates under makes it mandatory for insurers to provide cover if an event is declared. As a consequence, we've got very high participation amongst insurers, almost full participation in the market, and by accident, I think, of design, the scheme has been very efficient and effective in the way it operates. Thanks. There's been quite some discussion this morning on exclusions in the scheme, but I'll just briefly say that the ARPC scheme is quite broad in what it covers. It does very broadly cover commercial property, business interruption. It covers unusual assets like roads, rails, tunnels, infrastructure that are privately owned. It interestingly includes cover for property owner's liability. So if a property owner is negligent, that liability exposure is included in the scheme. So it is broad. As a reinsurance company, we follow the primary insurer's policy. And so for issues like contingent business interruption and prevention of access, we provide cover where the policy provides the cover. So we had an example of that. There was a small terrorist attack. Well, it was big psychologically, and people were killed and harmed in the Lint Cafe incident in Martin Place in Sydney. And in that attack, the insurance losses were about $4 million. It was mostly a very small damage incident, but very, very significant psychologically for the community. And we had about 60 businesses that were in the exclusion zone for that incident that were able to claim for prevention of access, just as an example. We have exclusions in the scheme, but the big exclusions are really around workers' compensation and CTP. But we have an exclusion for computer crime, which knocks out cyber terrorism, which I'll talk on in a moment. And also there has been exclusions for high-rise residential and buildings that are of mixed-use residential and commercial nature. Now those exclusions have been removed from this Saturday upcoming. Just like to talk briefly about the changing threat in Australia. This slide comes from the Attorney General's Department, and the Attorney General's Department in Australia is responsible for our national security and intelligence agencies. So they describe the threat as changing, and we've talked about this, but let me be brief. The threat's changing from being organised attacks to inspired attacks. It's changing from massive damage targets to sort of psychological impact targets. It's changing from conventional attacks to very simple attacks, and it's changing from a focus on infrastructure attacks to being anywhere. But at the very bottom of this slide, on the left, it says that Historically, there's been a focus on hardening infrastructure and preventing access to explosives and materials to cause attacks. And there's a plus in the middle at the bottom. And the focus for the Australian government at the moment is really around community. So there's a very important risk mitigation around social cohesion, and there's an effort to run programs on countering violent extremism. And so the way I describe the risk to our stakeholders is that I think that the threat of a large asset-based attack remains unchanged, but everyone's focus has been very much on the armed assault, and that exposure has increased exponentially. So from a relative perspective, people believe that the threat of an asset-based attack isn't there anymore. I think that's a false thinking. Thank you, Julian. So in terms of the threat in Australia, people often have a perspective that Australia is on the other side of the planet, and we're very far away from the rest of the world, and we are. It takes a long time to get here. But we have a very high level of activity going on around counter-terrorism. 62 people have been charged over the last 2.5 years for terrorism offences. There have actually been 14 disrupted attacks over the last 2.5 years. 2 of those disrupted attacks were involving complex improvised explosive devices, and the others were all of an armed assault style. So there's a lot of community attention, lots of media, lots of political focus, and so there is certainly a very heightened awareness of the issue in Australia presently. So the scheme itself goes through these 3-year reviews. So every 3 years we have to justify our existence, and the last review, and they take a long time to do, but the last review was tabled in 2015, and it made 10 recommendations to improve the scheme. In fact, the primary recommendation that it said was that the government should adopt a medium-term policy position or policy view on the need for these schemes to exist. So it certainly sees that in the short term there's not going to be any change in the environment or the market that would enable the arrangements to be disbanded. So there's certainly support for the scheme from both the government and also the opposition parties. So we have very wide-ranging support in political parties. So the changes that we put through recommendations from the review included increasing prices. So we had a very significant legislated price increase. We increased the retentions for insurers in terms of how much they hold individually, their maximum retention and industry retention. We included into the scheme buildings that were of high value residential and mixed use residential and commercial. And certainly in Australia, that's increasingly the style of construction in cities, is a mixture of commercial and residential. And then lastly, we changed the legislation to ensure that biochemical attacks would be fully covered within the scheme. So that's all coming into effect on Saturday, actually. So 1st of July. About 2 weeks ago, I met with the Treasury Department in Australia to start the next process of review. And so we're already drafting up the terms of reference for the next review. Thanks, Julian. And the areas that we're going to look at in the next review really are the items being discussed today. So the government in Australia is very interested in looking at should cyber terrorism be included in the scheme. It's currently not. It's very interested in looking at how victims of terrorism are covered within Australia. There's very limited cover for that presently. And also an interesting issue not discussed today is around threshold. And there's a lot of process involved in declaring an attack and the reporting requirements. And where there's armed assaults with no property damage, our legislation is silent on when to initiate processes. And so certainly in the US scheme, my understanding is that the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act in the US has a $5 million threshold before processes commence. And that's something I think that's worthwhile having in the scheme design, where we've got a very high frequency of armed assaults happening. And I guess to finish up, the scheme actually has very wide support. We have regular contact with government, has a very high level of awareness of what we do. We engage regularly with all of our stakeholders, both insurers, reinsurers and property owners. And it's certainly a risk that's, as we've said this morning, is very long in nature and very unlikely to change in the short term. I think that's all my remarks for.
Thank you very
this
much.
afternoon.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Shall we carry on with Mark?
Yes. Good afternoon.